to start over again.
You can make your comments, John.
He says, okay. Welcome to College of Complexes. This is our 436th meeting since we started in February 2009. We put a speaker on every week, a different subject. We require our speaker to take a position on an issue or express a point of view. They have to be for or against something. We don't care what it is. We give them an hour to make a presentation. If they have over an hour, we cut them off. If anybody interrupts the speaker, we might interrupt them. Listen only one fool at a time, one of our rules. Then we have questions and answers from the audience, not speeches. Then we have remarks, rebuttals. Everybody in the audience that wants to gets 5 minutes at the podium here to respond to the speaker said for or against. Our speaker gets the last word, gets a comment, and close the meeting. That's how it works. But before we put in our speaker, we have time for announcements. Anybody have any announcements they want to make? Now's the time to do it.
All right, I got one, I guess.
Go ahead.
Philosophers Forum is having another meeting this Tuesday. The talk starts at 7:30 at El Phoenix off of Skillen and Abrams. And I forget what the talk is about, but it'll be interesting, whatever it is. So you're welcome to come. It's $5 at the door to come in, and if you come between 6 and 7:30, you can enjoy dinner and some interesting and titillating conversation.
Any other announcements? Now's the time. Any announcements to make? He's making one. He hasn't decided. Anybody else have any announcements? All right. Okay, our speaker next week is Tony Robinson. He's going to talk about the power of small numbers. It ought to be interesting. It's on your itinerary. I'm not going to read all this. On December 1st, we have the question of juvenile criminal justice reform. Elizabeth Cooey is our speaker. That's on their itinerary also. December 8th, the JFK assassination. Was it a mafia hit? That's Jim Gatewood. He wrote a whole book about it, and it was on a commission concerning it, so that'll be interesting. December 15th, Cult of Saints and Relics, Medieval Martyrs and Miracles. That's Dr. Paul Benson. He's usually been here at Christmas several times for this. It ought to be good. Anyway, it's on your itinerary. But our speaker tonight is Gary Foster. He's got an MS from Texas A&M Commerce, the BS University of Central Oklahoma. He's Cherokee and Pawnee. He's going to talk about don't like fake news, then you should not be an American Indian. He proposes that the correct version of American history be accurately told, that the government from local to national reinforce or change a more accurate depiction of American and Native American history. He points out, for example, that Columbus came to the land of the United States but not discover America. Gary also shows that Indians did not have a great get-together with the early colonists on the first Thanksgiving. He points out there are just two things, these are just two of the myths that have marginalized American Indian and elevated conquering European military forces during the early years of takeover of the North American continent. These lies have been perpetrated ever since. They continue to make it look like American Indians are some needy simpletons who were lucky to invade. The invaders brought disease and land theft to North America. Gary argues and proposes that Columbus Day should be removed as a holiday and should be replaced as an Indigenous People Day, as this can begin with the city and county of Dallas, the Dallas ISD, and cities and school district inside Dallas County acting in this direction. He also argues that the story of Thanksgiving is also a lie. A day to give thanks for the riches of America is a great idea, but including some mythical interaction with an American Indian tribe is an insidious lie. Gary will show that a more historical accurate first Thanksgiving than the one we probably learned in our early school years. He concludes asking that we support rewriting Texas history books. The Texas Assessment of basic skill test in the curriculum of charter and private schools to be required to teach the truth inside Texas in any school. So without further ado, please give a very, very warm welcome to Gary Foster.
Well, thank you all for inviting me back. I appreciate that. Some of what Tom said is right in his introduction. And you can guess what the back half of that is. Some of it was wrong. So let me parse that out for you so that I get started on the right foot. It says he, being me, points out that Columbus came to the land of the United States, but did not discover America. So all of that's wrong. So Columbus never came to either North America, nor did he come to the United States. He got as far as the Bahamas, and then he went over to Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and he thought he was in Asia. He was positive of it and proud that he had found Asia, and he never stood anywhere near what we know as either North America or now the United States. He was nowhere near. So here's the picture. Here's the picture that you know. You've seen up.
Here I'm at.
Okay. There's the picture that you know. On the right of the picture are the Spanish people, and they're hailing their great leader, Christopher Columbus, who is giving thanks to his Christian God on his knee. And next to him is a representative of the Pope. And between the two of them is the savage Indian who has accepted Christ as his Savior and is also reverently kneeling, giving thanks between the priest and Columbus, and behind him in the shadows lurk the misty, questionably trustworthy Indians off on the left, certainly in the dark. And that's what our belief, that's what our picture that we have taught to every one of us, and still do. And that same picture or a similar picture is probably up in almost every classroom, and that question is on, as Tom did point out, the tax test or the Texas Assessment of Basic Skills, where it's asked, who discovered the United States? And you know what the right answer is on the test. Christopher Columbus. Don't dare answer Leif Erikson.
Yeah.
Or don't dare answer Americus Vespucci, for whom the country is named. And there are others that we believe may have been here long before those. So we know this, but it's not the right answer. The right answer is that Christopher Columbus is the finder and the bringer of all good things to the United States. So, and we teach that to children. I was in a little play when I was in the 5th grade. Back then, there were 3 television stations in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and on Sunday morning they didn't have any news. So they would open it up, literally one of the 3 major networks. They would open it up to the Tulsa Public Schools to present a 30-minute play on television, and there I was as acting as the priest for exactly this picture here. So I know it. I know that that's what's taught because I was in the play. So what is really the truth? Well, there are a couple of truths, and I'm going to bounce back and forth a little bit. First of all, let me point out to you that as for Dallas and as for what Tom said, what my proposal is. My proposal is that Texas would do away with the celebration of Columbus Day and replace it with Indigenous Peoples Day.
Amen.
My wish is that the city of Dallas would do that, and they just did. Now, in addition to that, I would hope that the Dallas County Commissioners Court follow suit and do that. So that's still up in the air. So you would need to talk for me. You would need to talk to your Dallas County Commissioner. I don't want to hear any comments, but my commissioner is John Wiley Price, and he will listen to that. Commissioner Daniels will listen to that. We have a good commissioners court, and as long as they hear it from voters, then they will be open to listening to that. Minnesota has done that already. Vermont has done that already. Alaska has done that already. South Dakota has done that already, and Colorado has done that already. So it is 1/10 of the way done. And really, this is a relatively new movement. There are a couple of jurisdictions that had done that 10 years ago. Cities, Los Angeles, Seattle, St. Paul, Minnesota, Denver, Norman, Oklahoma. Nobody said anything. Eugene, Oregon, Brunswick, Portland, Maine, Salt Lake City even has done that. So the list is on to about 50 other cities that have already done that. Austin, if I didn't tell you, did that earlier this year, and we're still waiting on Houston, and still waiting certainly on the cities in the west of the state to do that. So why do we have Columbus Day then? If Columbus never came to the United States, if he didn't have anything to do with the discovery of this continent of North America, then where did this story come from? And when did it show up? And the answer is that it showed up about 1792. Think about the country. It was 100-ish years old. Immigration was beginning to be a big thing. And what city was the biggest city in the country?
New York.
New York. So, Tammany Hall existed. And the first known, or the first that I could find, celebration of Columbus Day was done by the Society of St. Tammany at Tammany Hall in 1792. Tammany Hall was also known as the Society of St. Tammany or the Columbian Order. Tammany Hall was mostly an immigrant society and mostly a Democrat society and mostly, this may be the most important, a Catholic order. I don't mean to go off on anything really about religion, but it has always played a big role in American Indian history. So, the Columbian Order was wrapped around the name of Christopher Columbus, and these people had become starting to edify him as someone that they could hook their hook to in order to garner support in the history books for their presence, for validation for their presence in the United States. So I'm going to read to you. I'm going to do that several times. I didn't do PowerPoints, and it's a good thing. Taking the name of Columbus was partly intended to rebuke Protestant leaders. They knew Columbus himself was sent in the name of the church, in the name of the Catholic Church. So Columbus was a perfect saint for this movement because he was Catholic. What I read pointed out that he was Genovese Italian, and Italy didn't exist when he came. So even more to the folly of the story that it just can't be true. As an American hero, it also sought to bring up, to lift up Catholic immigrants. So if they named Columbus as their patron, then they believed that all Catholics could then become full members of American society. So interestingly, even more, to me, the story just kept getting funnier and funnier. If you think this is funny, in a way I don't, but the folly is certainly great. So of the first 28 members of Tammany Hall, 16 were born where? You guys who know your history.
Ireland.
Of course, they were Irish. So here they were going, yeah, yay for the Spanish Catholics, yay for the Spanish Catholics. And it was the Irish that were doing it. 16 were born in Ireland out of the first 28. They were all immigrants, and they were trying, of course, to propel themselves into the middle class. The idea of hosting then a celebration of Columbus Day or Columbian Day was extremely important to them. So they placed an emphasis. One of the things that was different, and if you know your history, one of the things that was different was that the emphasis wasn't placed so much on religion as it was placed on, and this sounds familiar in these days, on loyalty. What was the most important thing in the Tammany Hall was not your religion, that you are Catholic or Irish, but rather that you were loyal to the organization, you were loyal to the theme of Columbus. And so how did it become such a strong tool is because there was no dissension within the group. It just wasn't allowed. One way that we can pitch a good story, and we're seeing the same thing these days, One way that we can pitch a good story is for everybody to be quiet, even if they disagree. And it works. So unlike many Catholic, I already said that. So they considered it a knighthood. And what does that remind you of? Is anybody in here Catholic? Okay, and so if I'm going to talk about a Catholic order, of which Catholic order am I going to speak?
Knights of Malta.
Columbus.
Knights of Columbus, close.
Oh, yeah.
Knights of Columbus. So the second time that we saw Columbus Day was in 1892. It was 100 years later. They kept thinking about sailing the ocean blue. 1892, President Benjamin Harrison also celebrated or declared Columbus Day. So why would he do that? Does anybody know what's unique? I was fascinated by all of this. Does anybody know what's unique about Benjamin Harrison? Whatever it was, his relative was the shortest term president ever in 32 days, I think. But he wasn't. He lived a full life. So Benjamin Harrison was president in 1892.
88.
And in 1892 he was president.
Still.
And we just pointed out he was running for what? He was running for re-election.
Yep.
And how many people in here know how the electoral college works? And what was unique about the election of 1892? Well, one of the things that was quite unique about it was that it was one of the few elections that was decided by about 40 electoral votes without Benjamin Harrison having the popular vote. And one of the things that kicked him over in the electoral college was that in a very tight race, he won, guess what?
The Irish vote.
New York. It just keeps developing. The story keeps developing. He won the Irish vote. He won New York, and that kicked him over in the electoral college. And so in 1892, on the way to that campaign victory, he decided that we needed to celebrate Columbus Day again. And so if I fast forward, then we didn't hear a lot about Columbus Day. The Knights of Columbus grew. The Knights of Columbus grew greatly in the next 50 years or so. They had already grown up until 1892. They had grown so much that it wasn't just Tammany Hall that was going to vote for Benjamin Harrison if he declared Columbus Day, but it was also the Knights of Columbus. The Knights of Columbus by that time had developed 32 orders, I think they called it, levels, just like the Masons. Catholics were not allowed to be Masons. And so this was literally a side-by-side way that you could be just as good as a Mason and still be Catholic. And so the next guy that rolls around, it's always the guys, the next guy that rolls around that is interested again in Columbus Day happens to have been the longest serving president ever. So do we see a theme here that it's a way to play, to vote, to get, how do you get elected 4 times? You keep pandering to different people. You build a wall in Atlanta and you build a wall in South Dakota and you make sure it's there. You declare parks all over the country, and you also support Columbus Day. And so the next guy that came along that declared Columbus Day was Franklin Roosevelt in 1937. Once again, a year before presidential election, and that has stood since Franklin Roosevelt. Nobody has asked why since then. So really, you can see that the myth of this is really just a story, but the sadness to it, in my mind, is that we teach little kids. Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, and all the little kids say that back, and we show them the picture of the priest and the Indians cowering in the back, and we call that history. And we print it in all the history books, and we even make them take tests on it, and it's not right. True, false, you can argue about all you want, but it's right and wrong. I don't think you can argue much about it. It's not right. When I said that it would become important, when Roosevelt declared a national holiday, a guy named it was the Knights of Columbus that asked him to do that through their national convention, asked that he do that, and he did. So it really becomes the Knights of Columbus, and I don't really know much about them. I've been to meetings in their buildings. I had a fraternity brother who was a member, but outside of that, I was Catholic growing up, but I don't know much about it. So I'm not saying anything negative necessarily about them, but I am saying something that I believe to be factual about the history and the way that it became law. This may be short. So, any questions about that? Be a good place to just say, does anybody have a question? I'm not quite done, but I don't mind breaking it into two pieces. Yeah, that I can answer.
What about the history books? Some of the books that I'm reading, they're not. I know the history books are completely full of falsehoods. I think naming the holiday was that Government Lie Awareness Day might be a good name.
Well, or at least an act of convenience.
Right.
You know,
But also,
nice.
I've read that Columbus may have been part of some secret societies that had advanced knowledge of America.
I'm not a big Columbus expert. I can tell you what I did find out in reading, and that I didn't go down chasing that rabbit. But he has some pretty bad press. And the idea that he had his army chop off the head of all of the natives that were near him and all of that stuff, at least by what I read, is not quite right. Here's the real, the horrible truth. Apparently the cows, these ships were full, define full. I don't know how many cows there were, but apparently there were cows on the ship, and that's what they ate. And when they unloaded the cows onto Hispaniola, which is the Dominican Republic, or what first was called Santo Domingo. So when they did that, 92%. Think about that. 92% of the native population died within a year. 92%. Now, so they didn't need to have a war. They didn't have anybody to make slaves out of. They had already decimated the entire population by accident.
But disease.
Yeah, from smallpox. I don't know how cows had smallpox, but what I read said they did then.
Well, I think I covered this before at your last talk, but there is actually a video producer here locally, a Jewish gentleman, who is working on an update on the history of Cristobal Colombo. And he claims that all his backers were actually Jewish businessmen, and that Cristobal Colombo was in fact Jewish. And well, here, you know. Okay, the question is whether you heard any.
Yeah.
Okay, now here's where it goes. Look at the timing. This was right when Ferdinand and Isabella were kicking the Jews out of Spain.
Yep.
And according to his story, that this was a covert mission, but it was to find a homeland for the Spanish Jews. What do you say?
I say that one of the things that matches your story, I say I doubt it because what I know of history says that the Jews were not politely invited to take their time to leave Spain. They were fed unsacred food and chased out of the continent. so you know, if you know anything about Muslim history, and I know just enough to know that the likelihood that they would have entertained keeping either Muslims or Jews is rather small. Now, one of the things that does match what you said is that there are a lot of myths. They're endless. The myths are endless about Columbus, and one of them is his name. Everything I read gave him a different name and a different origin, and so I'm not saying I don't believe what you've read, and I'm saying that there is an unfortunate likelihood that too might be right. There also is a disagreement. There's a disagreement. They believe, the historians that I read believe that the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria is a bunch of hoo-hoo too. And that wasn't even the name of the ships. That was just easy to teach little kids. And so off they went with the story. And it was probably think about early American history, you had a population that had not read yet. You had an immigrant population that wasn't educated. So just like American Indians got their names, which happened to be truncated, I'd suspect that the ship names were also just truncated closenesses of what the real names were. Yes, sir.
Have you read Christopher Columbus's logbook?
I have not. What about it?
Well, no. I just thought I'd ask.
Yeah. I didn't. Interestingly, I didn't see a reference to that.
So your answer would be that you were not aware that Christopher Columbus was a Marrano there in Spain?
No, I did not see that anywhere. In the very back, well,
Did you say Dallas had made it
yes.
indigenous? When did this happen?
Boy, 2 weeks ago, something like that. Austin, let me get back on the mic. Austin did it about a month ago, and I made some acid comment on Facebook that Dallas needed to catch up with our friends to the south, and Omar Narvez posted back, "We just did." So it did indeed happen.
So, what was the origin of the Knights of Columbus, and what was their purpose?
What was what?
What was their purpose?
Purpose. The purpose was to give integrity to Catholic immigrants. They were, remember, I remember 1962. I was young, very, very young. But I remember on the television hearing smears because a Catholic was running for president, and I had gone to a Catholic nursery school, and I had learned the catechism, and my mother's best friend was Catholic, and I was like, what's the deal with that? If Anne can be, if my godmother is a Catholic, how can that be bad? And so they, 200 years before that, they were looking for any integrity that they could get. And, boys will be boys. They were looking to be just as good as the Masons. They needed to be just as good as the Masons.
So, did Queen Isabella send Christopher Columbus to find a trade route to Asia or not?
How funny, I don't know. I was just looking for Columbus Day. I wasn't looking for...
I mean, because that's what we were taught, right?
I didn't even look for that. I just looked for Columbus
I'm
Day.
sorry to ask you a question. Isn't that what we were taught in school, that Queen Isabella sent Christopher Columbus to find a trade route to Asia?
I grew up in Oklahoma, my friend, and that's not what I was taught.
When he hit that it was Asia?
I can answer the question only for myself.
Okay.
And what I was taught was that he was sent here to discover America.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, that's...
Now the Knights of,
How could you discover something?
you want to ask a question?
Yeah, right.
Wow.
Yeah.
Here you go, Tom. You want to ask that as a question?
So the question is, how could someone discover something, be sent to discover something, when they didn't know it was there?
A good point. Maybe I didn't ever... Okay. Maybe I didn't ever question it, and that's exactly my point. Nobody here questioned whether Columbus, well, I assume, nobody here really questioned whether Columbus Day was a valid holiday or not. We just repeated it to the kids and had them draw pictures.
I was told that Columbus was sent, similar to what he said, that he was sent to find a short route to
That's
the
right.
Indies.
That is.
Yeah.
If I think about it, yep.
And that's why he called it Indians.
Right.
Yep, there we go. But he thought he had found literally India, and you're right. Come to think of it, there was one of the things that I did come across that's related to that was that he, by a lot of historians, he was also sent to prove that the earth wasn't flat. And at that time, this is just what I read, and I'm not going to get off on geography or flatness of the earth, but the earth had already been proven to be round, and that's just part of the lore that goes with Christopher Columbus. Yes.
Yes, there is a tombstone in Westford, Massachusetts, of a Knight Templar that is dated 157 years before Columbus. There is also, are also petroglyphs in the mountains in New Mexico of ancient Egyptian, Chaldean, and Norse paintings preceding the Viking Age.
One of the things that I read, it finally tickled me enough in my head. One of the things that I read was that the Phoenicians are suspected to have come, which would almost match exactly what you said. Probably was simply the origin for that sentence.
My statement is,
In the mic, Calvin.
okay, we were taught that Columbus discovered America, but we also were taught.
Can you turn the mic towards you? Just ice cream cone.
He's trying to talk to me too.
Listen,
Here, I'll come this way too.
I can talk loud enough for you to hear. I was taught that the Vikings actually did it. And the other thing that I learned is, you remember the Moors of Spain?
Yes.
And I think that the Queen had a husband, and the rumors are that the Queen and Columbus was kind of too friendly. So he wanted to get him away. So,
Wouldn't be the first time.
Okay, a quick lesson on the mic for everybody who wants me here is the mic has angles. When you go like this, the mic starts rejecting. When you go like this, the mic is hearing you.
And the importance of the mic.
I think it's off on the right, or
So
my
that it
right,
can be
your left.
recorded, right?
That's
There was also a big article I read not too long ago about how the Chinese had a huge ship that they sent to America as well.
Well, I do want to use what you just said. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we're going to let me be the authority, or I've got the microphone. So the myth has been for, I don't know, 1,000 years now, that American Indians are really just Chinese who sort of morphed, and that they walked over on land that existed between here and Asia, and that also is hoo-hoo. The DNA has been proven to be distinct, and imagine that people actually inhabited all the earth, not just Europe, and so American Indians are distinctly American Indians, and their DNA is distinctly American Indians. So probably the reason that you had heard that story could be true, but probably the reason you had heard that story was as part proof, so to speak, of part of that story. I wouldn't call it a myth, but I will call it a story. The story that American Indians really are just Asians, fast forwarded a few years.
There was an admiral in China, Xing Ho, I think his name was, who brought the first giraffe to Beijing in 1017. And he had, I think, 25 or 27,000 sailors, a fleet of ships. His master ship had 7 masts, red silk sails. It was 150 feet wide. And he sailed the world. And they think he came to America, although they don't have proof of that. But he certainly went to Africa.
Yeah, I don't know. Now, there is a backside. Let me take one more question. I know it's out of character to open it to questions, but I'm breaking this into 2 pieces. I'm going to jump over into Thanksgiving Day here in a second. And so I'm kind of covering Native American holiday myths. That would be the topic.
So just to clarify, you're stating that Native Americans evolved from other species in the same way here as they did in Asia or Europe or whatever?
Absolutely the opposite. Absolutely the opposite. If that's what you think you heard, that is not what you should have heard. I'm saying that, and let me be very clear, that the DNA for American Indians is completely different than for any other ethnic group on this planet. They evolved, if you want to use that word, and it's okay with me.
Well, okay, just to clarify, would you say then the DNA of Africans is unique to any other DNA on the planet?
Yes, by one, I think. It's identifiable. That I don't know my DNA either. It's identifiable, I think.
One more?
Yeah, I'd like to talk about the children. Now, we know what we've been taught, but what are they going to be taught? Do you know anything about that?
I know that the picture that I just showed you and the rhyme that I just talked about and the test question that I just told you are all contemporary. That's the question they're asked.
Are there any plans to revise our history books?
Oh, I'm sure if revise being the key word, I'm sure just yes or no, the answer to that's yes. Are there any plans that I know, that I've heard, to correct them? No. That I've heard.
So this myth is going to be perpetuated? Is that what you're saying?
With an uneducated populace, I would say it's almost guaranteed. So that's my purpose is to share with y'all what y'all, or in Oklahoma, with yuns, what where the story came from and what I believe to be the truth. Let's try one more.
I know as every summer, social studies teachers have to go to in-service, and if this has been changed, that will be addressed.
Praise God.
Yeah, I mean, that they do that. And the Texas legislature is revising, God forbid.
That just scared me.
Well, it is scary.
Okay, we're ready for part 2.
Okay, so part 2 is Thanksgiving. First of all, I want to tell you that Thanksgiving dinner is one of my favorite things in the year, and that idea is wonderful too. You know where I'm going to eventually go. That the Indians didn't invite the immigrants into their town for dinner, and they all had dinner, hugged, sang kumbaya, and they went off on their own way. You know that's not what I'm going to end up saying. So I'm just going to read to you. So there really are stories here. One, there was a Thanksgiving. The immigrants had a Thanksgiving ceremony every year, and so that was a normal thing for the new people to the continent to celebrate every year a Thanksgiving feast as best they could. There also was a green corn ceremony at the end of the harvest for American Indians to celebrate the harvest. So there really were celebrations that went on. So I'm just going to read because I don't have it all memorized. So the Algonquin tribe held 6 different Thanksgiving festivals during the year. The year was marked with a maple dance. It obviously happened when the maple started running from the trees. There was a planting feast. There was a strawberry festival, and I'm sure that the Cherokees, I'm really serious, I'm sure that the Cherokees still do that. There were summer green corn festivals, and in the fall there was a festival for thanks, and in midwinter there was Thanksgiving for the year, so it was a normal thing for there to be some type of Thanksgiving going on that the two of them might be at. So, Captain Miles Standish did, according to what I read, did invite Squanto. He was a Somerset and Massasoit leader of the Wampanoag tribe, and you've heard that. You've heard the Wampanoags, I think. And their immediate families to join Captain Standish for a celebration. But they didn't have any idea what celebration meant to American Indians and how many people would actually show up. So as the feast began, the pilgrims, the immigrants were overwhelmed at the large turnout, and it lasted for 3 days, which is very traditional still. If I go deep into what I call deep into Indian land, if I go into the back roads of Oklahoma for a funeral, it's going to go on for three days. That's still very traditional. That number is still very traditional. So the pilgrims, the immigrants, weren't prepared for this big of a gathering. And so the Massasoit gave orders to his men to go home and get more food. So it happened that the Indians gave most of the food, and there are stories about that. But I'm trying to shorten this if I can and read it at the same time as I say it. So for 3 days they feasted together, and there was a lot of peace and wonder and all of that stuff. So in the pre-dawn hours of the fourth day, the Indians were asleep. They both slept in the same camp. And they were surrounded by the English and the Dutch mercenaries. Apparently there were mercenaries in the group that were meant to be hired soldiers, who ordered the Indians to come outside. And those who came outside were shot or clubbed, and including the women and the children that came outside. And the next day, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony declared a day of Thanksgiving because 700 unarmed men and women had been murdered. Now, without me taking the time to read you, apparently that continued. That continued to be sort of a funny thing. I don't know how to say it, but that continued every year in every colony to be sort of a funny way to celebrate that time of the year and to call it Thanksgiving, and of course the rest is history. There are stories about the Sioux in South Dakota having similar experiences. Later, Abraham Lincoln is the guy that declared Thanksgiving Day, and once again we have a leader. Remember, we had FDR, who was trying to get elected to his 4th term. We had another president who was in a tight race and needed the electoral votes from New York. And here we have Abraham Lincoln, who is looking for a way to garner support for the North and hold states together. And so how do we do it? We come up with a day of unity, so to speak, on behalf of those who have gone before. So from an Indian publication, we're continuing our theme of honoring Native American culture and history throughout November. American Indian Heritage Month, which it is, even in this administration. Last week, we were excited to share with you the real story of the first Thanksgiving, curated from accounts by the ancestors of the Indians who were there and the Pilgrims who inhabited Plymouth Colony. This week, we take a closer look at what happened next after the first Thanksgiving. For many people, the story of Thanksgiving stops at the harvest and the happy ending. Often, people never stop to think about what happened next. In the same way, many never think about what happened in Native history after the treaties and the reservations. Yet, Native history doesn't stop there, and neither did the realities of the first Thanksgiving. The rest of the story untold is how that first harvest marked the end of Pilgrim reliance on their tribal neighbors. And the relationship brutally changed in terms for their charity and their compassion. The Wampanoag and other tribes got genocide, they lost their land, and they started to endure hundreds of years of oppression. So if you're going to grasp that untold story of after the first Thanksgiving, you only need to look at the realities of reservation life now. So they're saying that, their argument is that and today is proof positive. Now, I'm not sure that would prove what happened 300 years ago, but it would prove that we're continuing to do it. So what needs to happen to Thanksgiving? As far as I'm concerned, I personally, this is my personal opinion, I don't think we need to have Thanksgiving. It's a good thing to give thanks. It's a good time to give thanks, and it's common all around the world. So I don't have any problem with that. I do have a problem with the version of history that is taught, and I have a problem with the version of history that gets repeated between people and especially to kids. So with that, then I'll be quiet.
Okay, back to questions. I have one right off the bat. Sure. If in fact that slaughter did happen, and I'm presuming there is evidence of it, then how can we explain the Indian tribes dealing so affably later with both the French and the British as years went by? Because you would think with that large of a slaughter, they would simply not have any more dealings.
Well, and I'm going to do it. And you would think Ted Cruz would not be nice anymore, but to the supreme leader. But he kissed his feet. so that just happens.
Sort of an answer to John's statement. From what I have read, historically, before the white man came over here in his ravenous takeover of this continent from Europe, there were some 25 or 2,700 separate languages in North America.
Easily.
Which means that almost all of those tribes were wiped out. So they could wipe out a whole tribe and make friends with another tribe. But I look at the history of my ancestry, basically, and it's absolutely despicable. And the idea of the colonization that went on around the world in order to exploit economically all of the resources of these different peoples was also just such worldwide criminality. I know I used to know a man from Kenya, and they have the Mau Mau uprising, and we think of the Mau Maus as being these horrible, horrible people. Well, they were like the patriots here who rose up against England. They wanted the British out of Kenya. And this fellow who was from Kenya told me that after this dragging of a black man in East Texas behind a pickup truck until it killed him was a horrible, horrible crime. That in Kenya, the British did this all the time when they would catch a Mau Mau soldier, basically. So I look at our history here, and it's very difficult for me to believe anything that's in our history books.
It's hard, I agree.
It really is. And from what I read years ago also, that part of our constitutional principles were derived from the laws of the Iroquois nation, which was a rather advanced nation. Anyway.
Yeah, it was actually it wasn't a nation, just FYI, and I think that's what I'm supposed to do. The Iroquois was a confederation, and there's a difference. There were 7 different tribes that were part of the Iroquois Confederation.
What I've always been taught, and I don't know whether it's because of my race or what, but I've always been taught that the way that the American Indian was treated was despicable.
Good.
Was absolutely despicable. And I'm not going to compare it with any other nationality, but any other group of people. But it was absolutely despicable. And the first Thanksgiving was not the kind of Thanksgiving that we celebrate today. We don't give thanks for killing 750 people.
It was what I read.
Yeah.
It was as I read. Yeah.
And I personally have several American Indian friends who have really displayed to me, really told me rather, that they feel sorry that they ever even helped in any kind of way, that their ancestors ever even helped the pilgrims to begin with.
You know, go ahead.
No.
The one thing that that's important for me to pull out. You said what you said, and it stands and it's good. But the one thing that's important for me to pull out, if I'm going to help people get the point, is that you weren't given standardized tests when you grew up. And the evil of standardized tests is that there is one multiple choice answer, and it is law. It's not even really a choice. It is law. So it is law that the right answer be who was at the dinner table on Thanksgiving, and the answer B be the Indians and the white folk, and they loved each other, and that's one of the right answers. Also, actually, want to point out they weren't white. I mean, let's be real about that. These folks weren't from England. They were from Spain, most of them, some from Italy, and the mercenaries, heaven only knows where they were from. So really, when we talk about what the white people did to the Indians, I think it's important to have clarity that in the beginning, that's really not who was here. You go to Tallahassee, Florida, and you start learning some of their history, and it'll blow your mind about how the whole planet had come to Florida.
Well, Gary, I would like you to talk some about the ongoing genocide of the American Indian and Indian tribes. I know I had a girlfriend who was Creek Choctaw, and she had been medicated, declared clinically insane. Her children were taken from her. She was sterilized. And so she was dealing with all that for many years before I ever met her. And it seems to be not an isolated case at all. It seems like it's more of a program. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. Yes, I'm not prepared for that, but I unfortunately know and understand the question. So there's really two pieces to that. One is the children, and God forgive the human race, I don't know why, but Indian children have been coveted since the beginning of this country. And you know, I didn't prepare for that question. About 25, 30 years ago, the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed. The Indian Child Welfare Act says that an Indian baby, in the case of this woman, her children at least have to be passed to an Indian, certifiable Indian family. And that's hard. And it's up to the states to enforce it, even though it's federal law. And attorneys general often don't want to use the resources. That's a buzzword these days, right? We don't have the resources. So that's the first A. That's the A part to that. What happened to the children? So there is an Indian Child Welfare Act. And the idea of the Indian Child Welfare Act is that Indian children are only adoptable and fosterable by Indian people. There are all kinds of arguments all over that. Why would you give a poor baby, a starving baby, to a poor family just because it's Indian? I mean, to get it started. But you know, we just don't have time to. That's an act of, no pun intended. That's an act of Congress to talk about that. The other one is missing and what's the phrase? Missing and I think missing and endangered Indian women. There's actually an acronym for it, and the numbers are horrendous beyond belief, like 100,000. That over the last 50 years have just gone missing, disappeared. And so we can guess, I can guess, some of those disappearances, but 100,000, you'd think you'd notice. And so that, unfortunately, he's right, and I don't mistake me to hear that I am saying that, yeah, we used to think, no, now we know. And now it's happening. Today. Every day. You can go up into Oklahoma and each tribe will have posted. The two tribes that he mentioned are part of, he mentioned Choctaw and Creek, I believe, and those are both part of the 5 civilized tribes. Those, by many respects, are the most organized tribes as far as identification and healthcare and networking and communication and closeness, proximity. And it happens right there in the Cherokee Nation. 17 counties. Where did they go? I don't know. Where did the children go? I don't know.
So what are your thoughts on the Republicans disenfranchising Native Americans in North Dakota in the most recent election?
how do I answer? I do want to answer that. I don't mind answering it. I don't know that we really want to spend time, so I'm trying to think before I answer.
Yes, we want to spend a whole lot of time.
So, North Dakota especially, I think it's fair to call out North Dakota because North Dakota, second probably, where else? What other state has a worse record? I don't think another state has a worse record than North Dakota. So I pray that that is the worst of what we see. However, I think it's more important to realize that these issues will be heard by an appeal court, which doesn't really exist. The state appeal court does not exist in North Dakota. It is going to rubber stamp that and send it on to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to rubber stamp the court in North Dakota. So what I think about it is that we are about to see it repeated over and over, and I think that just like the children, here we go off on a tangent, but just like the children in cages in the South, I believe that's a test. I believe that's a test to see what we will put up with, and unfortunately we will put up with it. And I think the same thing is true of what happened in North Dakota. I believe that was a test to see if people would get upset because somebody else lost their voting rights in a perfectly valid way, and see if anybody cares. And you're the only one I've heard yet that said anything about it.
I got one question. It was brought up, you brought up earlier that the American Indians' DNA is separate from everybody else. I was taught, I guess we all were taught, that the human race began maybe in North Africa, and everybody here is interrelated, and if you check DNA all the way back, there was somewhere an original person, that began this human race. Well, also the Polynesian islands were populated by Indians or people who lived in Honolulu and different places, and possibly immigrated all the way to South America and so on. So my point is that do you think that we all came from one place, or do you think there's a separate?
Oh dear me, you're asking me to.
In other words,
yeah.
I'm not saying they're Chinese that came over. I'm saying that no.
What do I believe? Yeah, I believe there's more than one origin for the human race.
All right.
Yeah, that's what I believe. At the same time, the specific theory to which you're referring is called the Bering Strait theory. The idea is that a bunch of Indians with children on their back marched across the ice into Alaska and down into Oklahoma. And I don't know. That's the new research in the last 3 years. The new research says no.
What about the Polynesian islands? How they
Yeah,
and then that could also go to South America and then from there.
Yeah, I hear you, and I don't know the answer to that.
All right.
And actually, South America in particular would be one reason I would say, no, I don't believe that. Now, whether that's heretical, I don't know.
The numbers you mentioned of the missing women from the Indian tribes is horrendous, but it is small compared to what happens in this country every year. According to 3 different sources, all of which I consider to be very, very reliable, anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million children per year disappear in the United States.
I didn't know.
And Ted Gunderson, who used to be the head of the FBI in Dallas and later in Los Angeles, stated in a group we were together that 750,000 a year disappear, and probably in human trafficking.
It's terrible. It is what I was thinking about. That it hit me. That's how old minds are. Missing and Endangered Indigenous Women is the acronym. Missing and Endangered, Endangered Indigenous Women is the, I told you there was an acronym. I didn't know that, and that's terrifying. I don't know what to
Could
say.
be the same, there could be a same root cause and that could have been because the same people that are taking those other children find it easier to get Indian children.
Oh, I absolutely believe that. Yeah, it's doing, you know,
Easy pickings, as they say.
it's biblical unto the least of these. It's not the way he said it, but
Yeah.
Well, I also think that it starts with our language too. When we're talking about civilized tribes and uncivilized tribes, I mean, it's the language that we use in characterizing people as other. I mean, I think that goes a long way into the thinking in the beginning of the myth.
Repeat what you said, it was on microphone.
I think that we need to look at the language that we use. When we call Indians, American Indians, civilized tribes and uncivilized tribes.
well,
I mean, I think that that's a characterization
no, it is.
that really does a job on the psyche. And I think that we should be very aware of that and embrace, and it's the beginning of these myths that have formed about American Indians. That there are savages. Number one. I think that, again, I mean, it goes back to what I originally said. Our treatment of the American Indian is despicable. And we as a nation will pay a price for that.
That's what every all prophecies say. Yep. So let me just clarify, because I don't want anybody to take what I said wrong, but I do want to be in the right place when I say it. I did mention civilized tribes, the 5 civilized tribes. So let me tell you sort of who decided that? Well, of course, the 5 civilized tribes decided that. The Cherokee, the Creeks, the Choctaws, the Seminole, and I can almost do it. They decided that. But they're a real thing. And let me tell you about the Cherokees. That's with which I'm most familiar. Civilized as in most similar to white people. Or, if you use my language, most similar to immigrants. Cherokees had banks. It's in North Carolina. Cherokees had, I know it's socialist, but that's too bad. They had free housing for everybody in 2-story apartment complexes. They had a free public education in 1 year after Sequoyah penned the Cherokee alphabet. Every Indian child knew the entire alphabet and could spell words. So that's part banking, certainly, heaven forbid, in theory, is part of civilization. And so, question that. But, so those 5 civilized tribes are a real thing. That doesn't mean that the other 477 that we know of are not. And all of them, when we say that, somebody said there used to be 2,500 or something, I believe was the number. Absolutely, 100% at least. And really, if you were going to be accurate, you would parse tribe not by who signed up at the table when the soldiers marched them, which is how I'm a Cherokee and how I'm not a Pawnee, because my grandmother refused to sign the book. if you do it that way, well, then one thing matters. I think it would be, you know, if you're really going to be anthropological about it, I believe it would be much more correct to do it by language, in which case there are 7 to 24 Cherokee dialects and 7 clans. We can go on for, I mean, literally ad infinitum.
Just curious, has any mathematician ever figured out the grand sum total of the value of all the lands, gold, silver, furs, forests, natural resources, minerals that belong to all the Native American Indian tribes? What the value of that would be in current present day dollars? And what are the possibilities of giving the indigenous Native American peoples back the whole country, put everybody else on reservations, or send them back to where their ancestors came from? Such as, you know, Spain, Europe, whatever, Africa, wherever.
Well, I want somebody to do the work. So, I'm actually serious. I have just enough economics education, just quite a bit. I would say that it would seem to be the present and future gross national product of the United States. It would seem like that's only reasonable to me, without thinking about it much deeper. So every penny earned today and every penny earned in the future. What was that was part A, the value. Oh, I also want to point out that out of the 577-ish tribes that exist, many have sued. For instance, the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. There are 3 Cherokee nations that are recognized by the federal government, which is part of the divide and conquer strategy. And of those 3, the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma has sued for the rights, their treaty rights, for the rights to all the minerals and all the water which has flowed and will ever flow down the Arkansas River, and is sued for reparations for the damming of the Arkansas River in Colorado. So, I mean, has that gone anywhere? And actually serious, every now and then you get a little bit. And you take one little baby step forward, and they do actually. There's a whole class of lawyers called Indian lawyers, and there are many schools where there's a class of lawyer for everything, right? So there's a class of lawyers called Indian law, and that's one of the things they do is to sue this and that government for this and that thing. And the Pawnees. My mama bought her house. For those of you who think Indians are rich because we get money from the government or casinos, first of all, casino money, about 2/3 of it goes to the state or to managers, which are actually political pundits. And the other 1/3 is used to pay the employees, pay the costs, and then invest in the tribes. So that's one part of it. Okay, so where I was going with that was that the Pawnees, there were only 18,000 Pawnees that left Nebraska. This is why my grandmother wouldn't sign the roll. And 800 and some odd arrived in Oklahoma as part of the Grand March. And they actually sued because they said, well, you owe us for Nebraska. And in 1965-ish, they got $3,000 each for the state of Nebraska. So do they sue and do they get something back? Yes, but A, the lawyer always gets what? At least half. And B, you never get what you asked for.
Well, Gary, let me discuss a big granddaddy step backward.
Okay.
On Highway 9 east of Norman, somewhere out there, a little gas stop, there was an Indian circular, and they were discussing, the big lead article there was talking about the $11 billion of oil lease money that the Bureau of Indian Affairs had just ruled that they simply lost.
Yeah.
It was just a bookkeeping error, and they no longer had the money, so you don't get it.
Yep. So no surprise. My mama was the secretary to the director. That's very apropos. I can't close it. I hope they don't say anything terrible. I didn't plan that. I'm embarrassed. Hey! Well, it's not over. Yep, I told you. You know how to turn one of these on? You're trying to hold this button here.
I can't even see what I'm holding.
I know, it's part of the deal. Right there. It's really hard to do.
How about that button over there?
Nope. There. U2 is gone.
Okay.
So your question was about, I actually have input into that. That pretty well blew my ability to concentrate. Your question was, who you just asked?
Well, let me ask you.
Oh, Bureau of Indian Affairs. I really do want to address that. So, in the history of this country, here's how it works. The Indian tribes are the recognized tribes. It's an important word. So, is it possible that you might be Indian, but like me, you don't have an Indian card, that your name is not on the roll, and that you therefore are quote not eligible for services? Yes, entirely possible. So first, you have to be recognized. And how do you get recognized? You get recognized because your grandmother went to the table and took a white name, and my Pawnee grandmother refused, and literally beside her place where her name goes, it says took no white name. And therefore I am not eligible for even to vote in the Pawnee tribe. That's the way the game is played. It's a pretty tough game. So, and every tribe has different rules. And all of those rules are enforced and adjudicated by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs manages the land and the services for the people, if you want to call that management. And he just pointed out a really perfect example of where did it go? We don't know. And I'm going to politicize this. In the history of this country, the only person who has appointed an American Indian as director of the Bureau of Indian Affairs was Barack Obama. The only one ever. At no other time has there ever been an American Indian that was director of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So who's in charge of Indians, not the Indians?
Yes, you mentioned that the Indians have this distinct DNA. is it common, is there a common thread across all the tribes, right across the 3,000 miles or so of America? Are they all related in some way?
Yeah, you're getting me past what I really know. I know that I've read articles, it's what I know. I know I've read articles in the last 3 years, good, what do you call those, vetted, but they're also endorsable scholarly articles.
Peer-reviewed.
Thank you, that's the word I was looking for. Peer-reviewed journals that say that they finally parsed out. Now, how far they've parsed it out, I don't know. I can't tell you. But what I do know is that I am to understand that the Bering Strait theory, which is what I've been taught all my life, is not valid. Yeah, so I don't know anything really more than that.
So did they say how, because actually I think they can tell, when they seek to back how far in millennia that they go back. So have they ever traced it back to how many millennia?
The question really more appropriately is have you ever read? No, I haven't. I mean, I don't know what they have and haven't done. Yeah. I'm serious. All I paid attention to was, is the Bering Strait theory valid or invalid?
I would just like to point out that in every segment of humanity, whether it's race, color, creed, nationality, religion, every division has both wonderful people in it and heinous criminals in it. Every single one of them. And to point out that one person is a criminal doesn't make a person an anti-this or an anti-that. It's just talking about that one person. Now, from what I have read, the Iroquois were a very advanced group of people.
Agreed.
However, the Hurons, who lived right up there with them, were cannibals.
I don't know that.
I have read that.
Okay.
And that's horrible. But nevertheless, there's that too. So you can't just throw a blanket over everybody.
Oh, I agree. I hope I didn't.
No, you didn't.
Yeah. Behind you, Tom.
Okay, I was just doing a little research while you were talking.
Good.
And apparently there are two theories. One of them is that that human beings originated in Africa. That's not, okay? The two different theories are that there was a diaspora 5 million years ago, which means that human beings on different continents evolved separately. The other one, which is the one that's more for which there's more evidence, is that 200,000 years ago is when this diaspora occurred, and that we all evolved. So there's less difference in the evolution of humans than there would have been had they separated 5 million years earlier. Follow what I'm saying? So what that means is sometime 200,000 years ago or so, a little bit before, a little bit after, according to the current theory, people came from Africa to North and South America somehow, like they did to the rest of the earth, but the separation of evolution was 200,000 years ago, not 5 million years ago.
Deal. I don't know. Yeah.
I think we struggle too hard to make the evolutionary theory work. I think one of the things that's emerged recently is that the human genome is much older than any of the ape genomes that we have here, which we kind of war against the idea of evolution out of. I could say, just to be disruptive, that I believe in the theory of seeding, that we had races that were seeded here, and I think there's evidence to that as well, because if you think about humanity and the human form, we're not really adapted to the environment. You know, there are a lot of ways we're not.
If I'm right, you're going into preaching, not asking.
There's a lot of ancient history that is being taught that's obviously false. They found archaeological evidence for civilizations that go back 250,000 years.
So, Tom, should I sit down? Because we're kind of not asking questions.
Yeah, you get to,
One last question.
look what time it is.
Yeah. How far back, as far as hundreds or thousands of years, is the history of the indigenous Native American Indians? How far back does it go before we got here?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer, and I should. I actually should know that. The anthropologists make a break in speech. They're like before speech and after speech. They also make a break in the use of tools. And only last year I sat and watched a Cherokee lady make a basket. And that sounds almost a simple thing to say. No. It was the absolute highest use of math I've ever seen. Literally, I'm serious. My brother's a nuclear engineer. It was the highest use of math that I've ever seen, and it was the most complicated to execute grid that I've ever seen. It was unbelievably difficult. And so, I don't know. Old. The languages, I can also kind of answer that in a just a broad maybe kind of thing. The languages supposedly have like 4 to 8, I don't remember the exact number. They call them roots. So the Cherokee language is one of the Iroquois, and you keep mentioning the Iroquois. Many of the languages in this part of the country over to Florida are part of the Iroquoian language, root language. And the one, this is a good example, the one that is not part of any root language, that has its own root, is the Navajo. Hence the use of the Navajo code talkers in World War II, because there literally was no root language anywhere in the world that was similar. It was completely different. And so, a pretty good question. If you believe in anthropology as a science, then, and you believe that the use of language to be a valid indicator of individuality, then how could then the Navajo, whose creation story starts from the ground, coming up? It's weird. It's a weird story. But it comes out of the ground, and it matches after the floods perfectly, or it even matches your theory. So how old? Man, very, very old.
6,000, 7,000,
Oh, easily. I would say more like 50. I don't know.
50,000 maybe years.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, very old. Best I can do.
Okay, now it's your turn to talk, so who wants to be first? You get to find out.
Yeah, right here.
Well, we got 5 minutes.
When I hear talks like this, I get the impression all natives are first cousins to Jesus Christ and never committed any sin, and any white man or European that settled the land was kin to the devil and couldn't wait to murder, maim, and kill any native he could get his hands on. Neither of which is true. In my research, I read 4 books about human sacrifice at one point because I wanted to get familiar with that concept and where it came from. The research I've gone into said that there were over 2,000 tribes of people living on the North American continent before the Europeans got here, and there was a war going on. They were killing each other, fighting each other, and they were doing a lot of really horrible things to each other. I'm sure there were some relatively good tribes, but there's no such thing as a human being that doesn't sin. It doesn't matter where you come from, how long ago you lived, or whatever. Every human being commits sin. And there were also red-haired giants that lived in North America that were terrorizing the Indians. And the Indians finally got together and killed them off. And you can find evidence of that in the mounds that are all over America, which the Indians did not build. Those mounds were built by somebody else before the Indians. But anyway, when the Europeans got here and settled the land, that ended this war that was going on all over North America. As to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, I read a book a number of years ago, or I bought a book a number of years ago. I finally read it within the past couple of years, titled Navajo, that I bought out in the Four Corners area. And it makes it pretty clear that the Bureau of Indian Affairs has been run by people who were not friendly to Indian tribes, and the Indian tribes have been greatly wronged. I mean, there's no question about that. But it's kind of like colonization. You know, the British Empire colonized a great portion of the world, and we could talk about the evils of colonization, but while there was a lot of evil involved, they built infrastructure in all of those countries that they colonized, which those countries used to build their country when the British pulled out. It's kind of like South Africa in a way. I mean, the whites settled South Africa, and they've been there for 400 years. They built a great country, and now they've been taken over by people who are promising to like murder all the white farmers. And if they keep going on the path that they're going on, they're going to be living back in huts and chasing animals for food, because they're just throwing away all the infrastructure that the white man built in South Africa. And when I hear Europeans and white men, you know, just denigrated like this, there's like a refusal to acknowledge the good that was accomplished. Yes, there was a lot of evil done by the people that settled this country. There was a lot of evil done by the people who were living in this country before it was settled by Europeans. It's not, you know, good on one side and bad on the other. So what we have to do is look at the whole picture and acknowledge what actually happened, and instead of attacking certain groups or people groups, why don't we look at who was doing good and who was doing bad, and attack the bad and acknowledge the good.
Y'all know I like statistics. So I looked up some, actually some I was looking up for 1% of the whole population, only 1% is American Indian of the United States. What does that say about genocide? And this concept that Ken mentioned about the white man, good or bad, whatever, I'm glad we keep talking about that, because with all the murders and the suicides that are going on, there's a problem. And I'm not indicting. I hope you don't think I'm indicting. You know, as I said last week, Tyler, Texas, the most Anglos, where the highest suicide rate is in Texas. But I was looking up suicide rates, and it says in the past 30 years, they've surged to their highest levels particularly steep for women. Substantial rise among middle-aged Americans whose rates have been stable since the 50s. Let me get down. American Indians had the sharpest rise of all racial and ethnic groups. 89% rise among women, and this is in the past 30 years, 38% for men. African Americans had the least rise, but then I've heard people say that suicide by cop may be the form of choice for the African American men. Let me see what else. Oh, Department of Justice shows that out of 2,000 Native American women's, 86% had experienced violence, and 90% of that 86% had experienced it at the hands of someone of a different race, non-Native Americans. So it's, as he said, it's still going on. I saw a movie a few months back about this. It's called Wind River. I don't know, did anybody see that movie? It is really incredible story. It's a true.
I'm sorry, what is the name of the movie?
Wind River. And it's a true story of a young Native American woman who was killed in Alaska. And as it turned out, it was Texas oil men who did it. Texas, you know, right up there with good old rowdy boys. But at the end, it gave the statistic that Gary said about all the missing women. And the numbers that they have do not reflect the number of incidents because most of the women don't report it because they're not taken seriously. And the story was told that one woman who had been kidnapped, drugged, raped, and held for days had got away. She escaped, and she went to the police for help. And they looked her up on the computer and found out she had a 4-year-old traffic ticket, and they put her in jail. So it happened again to her. And this is how seriously it was taken. And then the last thing on that was racial groups. The racial group most likely, this astonished me, to be killed by police is Native Americans. I had no idea. Okay. Why do we, and I'm not indicting anybody here, but why do we as a nation ignore all of this? I don't even remember where I was going to go with this. As Albert and Ken both pointed out, there's good and bad and all. And sometimes we tend to revere our forefathers, and they were rascals too. I'm losing my train of thought now. Anyway, there's another movie called Hostiles, and it's the savagery of the immigrants, Americans, and the Indians, and it shows brutality on both sides. As Ken said, it was a brutal time. I know a woman who said that her ancestors, Elder Brewster, came over to the colonies, and he was a reverend, and there was cannibalism. I mean, you know, and I've read incidents of cannibalism among American Indians too. So all the way around, it was brutal. But this movie, Hostiles, is interesting because it this cavalry was told to take these Indians that they had imprisoned to his final resting place. He was going to die, and the Indian and his family, who he was to escort, he didn't want to take because they'd killed his buddy. And in the end, they ended up supporting each other, and I don't know what I'm saying, the cavalrymen scalped the white man that killed the Indians' family. So it was an interesting switch in how he. It's just interesting, and I guess that's all I can make sense of right now. Oh, fake news. It's not what's said, it's what is not said. And our Texas legislature recently has voted that Helen Keller and Hillary Clinton will not be in history books. And Hillary is the first first woman to be nominated for by her party to be president, but they want to erase that as if it didn't happen. And so the erasure of news is to promote political agendas or support whatever somebody's trying to do.
I don't recall the Indian tribe that was working with the French during the French-Indian War, but that Indian tribe or group of Indian tribes actually won for the British, and let me explain how they did it. Is the French won an important battle against the British, and they disarmed the British and left them overnight while everyone hopefully got some sleep. During the night, the Indians were very upset because they were promised the goods of the British, and they didn't really understand what it meant to have a ceasefire and a truce and so forth, and they felt like they were being robbed. So they went and they began slaughtering the British in the middle of the night, and that got back to Britain, and that really kind of was a cathartic moment where the British rallied around it and then went on to win the British-Indian War. So, or French, they call it French-Indian War. And really strange name for a war when the British were fighting the French and Indians, but whatever. I think some friends did some research on the Ten Commandments and kind of did a reduction on it, and I reduced that a little further down to one statement, and you can debate me on this, but I think the Almighty's whole message to mankind is do not plunder. There's nobody out there who's not plundering somebody else. It's amazing. All the good Christians, the good Buddhists, the good Hindus, I mean, you name it, whatever religion, everybody's plundering everybody else and still thinking they're doing God's work. So we're in a new information age. The interesting thing about the information age is that all the wrong people are getting the information and all the wrong people are under the microscope. I would like my public officials under the microscope, not my neighbor. But one of the things the great information age helps to reveal is all these missing people and what's been happening, and especially what's the tribe up there in Alaska? Is that?
Oh, there's many, and they are
Inuit.
Inuits right there. Mm-hmm.
They've been some of the things being done in Alaska and in Canada to the Native Americans. You have got just systematic, regular extermination through some of the orphanages and stuff. I mean, there are things that are going on which we should be able to, as a people of the world, a unified people, we should be able to put a stop to this. Because it's not like we don't have the statistics now. We really do have the statistics now. Now back to Albert's number that he quoted Ted Gunderson saying, I don't like to get up here and dispute something, but I disputed that number with Ted Gunderson. I was working with and for Ted Gunderson back in the 90s and somewhat into the 2000s. And one of the things that was happening to me is I would go out with the number of 100,000 missing children, 100,000 kidnapped each year. I was getting hammered out there. I mean, I'm selling, all these interviews I've done with Ted and everything, and people are coming back on me, and I don't have any support for it whatsoever. So I go to Ted Gunderson, who headed up 3 major FBI offices, Memphis, Dallas, and Los Angeles. And I say, Ted, I can't support this number. Where are you getting this number from? His answer to me was, I believe that number. That's the answer of a head investigator, a man who had 700 people in his command there in Los Angeles FBI. We have an issue here where I'm out, and a lot of people are out there, and we don't have the statistical backup to support the numbers we're putting out, and it discredits everybody. The only problem is, years later, Ted passed away a few years ago. Ted's no longer there to question about it, but that number is becoming more and more credible as every year passes here. We have some serious problems in this country. We have Amber Alert in Texas. Why is that not going off 2,000 times at least, a year? It's not. We get a few Amber Alerts here and there. So how is this great caravan, if you will, of children, people, young women, how is that going on? And we're not seeing it. So I think that's a question for everybody, and if Gary has any input on that, I'd be happy to hear it.
Yes, actually, to give a little different perspective on colonialization and so on, there's a story that after the war, when the question of Indian independence in India was afoot, there was an American lady sitting next to Winston Churchill, and she said to him, Winston, isn't it terrible what you're doing to the poor Indians? And so Winston turned to her and said, Madam, what Indians are we talking about? Are we talking about the British Indians that thrived and prospered under our rule? Or are we talking about our American Indians that I understand have been decimated?
Again and again.
Anyone else? I guess I'm the last one standing. No one else, huh?
Should I go back? Wait on you.
Yeah, you get to do.
You get to respond to all this. Anyway, I want to thank our speaker for doing a great job here tonight. I forgot what I was going to say up here. I had it all in my head and it escaped me. But now it has escaped me. That's one of the problems. Anyway, you never know from where you sit how your pants line you stand up. See, you never know. So anyway, it proves that. But I'm trying to remember what it was I was going to say.
You're a missing person.
Yes,
you're missing your
something. It was
You just had a birthday.
Yes, I know. It was a very good. Maybe that's why. I don't know. Anyway, it was very good. I had what I had to say, and now I can't remember what it was.
Well, if you think of it, I'll be glad to hear.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to think of it. I have so far. I'm drawing a blank, which is very sad. This is not normal for me. Normally, I'm full of everything. But the tie-in is missing. We're going to give it back to you. If I think of it, I'll question you. But anyway, it's all yours. And
well said. I did leave, I think, something sitting at the table back there that I want to be sure to show you. Yeah. There's a good book that one of the theologists at Perkins School of Theology gave me called Everything You know about Indians is wrong. And it's written by Paul Chat Smith. It has, I find it interesting, it has no table of contents. The only way to find out is to read. And there are only like 4 chapters or 6. Paul Chat Smith is the assistant or associate, whatever they call it, director of the National Museum of the American Indian. And if you ever get a chance to hear him, he is an academician beyond belief, but is also will kind of broaden your mind. And when I read little pieces of this book, what Indian people, I mean, we could change the title, Everything Indians Know About Indians is Wrong. I mean, seriously, it's a very broadening thing. I don't know about everything, but a lot of things that American Indians think about Indians globally is wrong. So, on that vein, I'm not done, but on that vein, I want to make a disclosure, which I find very important for me, whether you do or not. That as I talk to you, I'm talking as Gary Foster. I'm not talking as the Cherokee tribe. I'm not talking about a member of a clan. I'm not talking as a representative of Dallas American Indians. I'm Gary Foster, and I am a card-carrying Cherokee, and my reality is mine and mine alone. And so don't think that because you heard me say something that it stands really for even one more Indian. I mean, it is my reality, and it's based on my experience. So the first person up in comments mentioned bad tribes. Now, whatever bad is, I don't know. One of the things to remember is that, like any people, all existing tribes before the invaders got here, and since then, everybody just reacts to what's happening in the world outside them. So you know, what we think of as a norm might not be a norm for somebody else. I think history has proven that pretty easily. So if we are just going to say globally, and it isn't exactly the way that I took that comment about bad tribes, but if we are just going to say that there were bad tribes when the invaders got to this continent, then I would argue, what about the invaders who had just gone through the Dark Ages? What about the invaders that had just gone through the Crusades? What about the birth of the Catholic Church? I mean, I could go on forever with that. So, ain't none of us saints, as my grandfather would say, my Pawnee grandfather, yet. So ain't none of us saints, and he would always wait, yet. So somebody else mentioned something about mismanagement, and let me go back to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Throughout the history, it was really something dreamt up, if that's the word, dreamed up, in the very beginning, as how can we make sure that this doesn't get out of hand in the future? How can we make sure that these Indian tribes don't independently succeed? And the answer is, we'll establish a government agency for them. And that'll guarantee that they right, what novel thought, right? That they won't succeed. And not only that, but we won't put one of them in charge of it. And that'll even further guarantee it. So we didn't go into an awful lot of things that the Bureau of Indian Affairs has done, but I can throw out one example. The Hopi tribe it's not a Hopi tribe. One of my points in a minute is that we have what are called, I'll parse it out for you, but the Hopi are called Pueblo people. They're not called Indians. So the Hopi people in Arizona sit on uranium. And you would think that we don't need much uranium, but it doesn't much matter how much we need. There's a corporation that wants it. And so the Bureau of Indian Affairs has, under this administration, ordered them to turn over their lands that have uranium on it, and they took it to the Supreme Court. The Hopi people did, and it won. My guess is it will go back to the Supreme Court again, and we will see how it does. So that's a good example. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is the one that sold the state of Nebraska to the Pawnee tribe for $3,000 a person. You know, they haven't exactly cut a fair deck throughout history. So my talk, what was my talk about? We sometimes in this group, and it's a beauty in a way, sometimes we kind of vary from what was the talk about and get into the origin of man and a few other very deep thoughts, and or women, and my talk was about Columbus Day, so don't forget that what I told you was that Columbus Day is a very usefully pinpointed tool that has won a couple of presidential elections and just happened to have stuck. And that it was a way to enfranchise, not disenfranchise, but enfranchise, especially the new immigrants which had come from Ireland and a few from Italy. And Thanksgiving has a very different history than the idea that the Pilgrims all sat down and ate turkey with the Indians. As a matter of fact, I think further on in my notes, but I'll say it now because I'm thinking of it, about 10 years after the first Thanksgiving, the term Thanksgiving Day began to be used for immigrants who were bringing in scalps to be traded in. So that was Thanksgiving Day, and they got paid for the scalps, and therefore, you know, it was a day to celebrate, and there was hoopla in the streets, and everybody was happy that could still talk. The statistic was a beautiful set of statistics. I have this to tell you. First, it doesn't matter what statistic you go after. Poverty, infant death, starvation, cancer, asthma, diabetes, rape, you name it. There will not be a statistic that you find upon which American Indians do not fall first. Yes.
You mentioned the Hopis. One little thing I thought you'd find interesting is that both the Hopis and the Zunis in their legends believe that their ancestors came from the Pleiades star system.
Exactly. There are all kinds of, I said that already. There are all kinds, I agree.
I missed that.
Okay, yeah, there are all kinds of those theories. So, doesn't matter what group, as I was saying, it doesn't matter what group, what statistic it is you're looking for, American Indians will be the most prevalent. Poverty, it's pretty bad. And there are so many programs to help. There's the American Indian Health Service, which is fascinatingly good in Oklahoma, but you get up in North Dakota and try to find an Indian doctor, and I'd be willing to bet you can't. I may be wrong. So I told you I'd give you this little litany. You just said you said Zuni, I think. Is that right?
Hopi and Zuni.
Hopi and Zuni are both, he gave me another example of Pueblo people. So those are, if you hear somebody talk about Pueblo people, or if you talk to a Hopi or Zuni person, you wouldn't say, how are the Indian people today? You would say, how are the Pueblo people today? And if they were going to go home, they wouldn't say, I'm going home to my tribe. They would say, I'm going home to my Pueblo. And some Navajos will also say that. It gets confusing. Some Navajos will also say that, depending on where they are in the Navajo Nation, which is by square miles the largest. The Canadians call Indians, so to speak, First Nations people, and that's true of all of Canada. And Canada has dramatically better protections for American Indian people, for First Nations people, but under the last administration in Canada, the Trans-Canadian, what was it? Oil?
Pipeline?
Yeah, pipeline. If you go onto YouTube and watch some of the videos of what the land looked like before, and it belonged to the First Nations people, and now look at it. And it will, if that doesn't make you cry, then you don't have tears. Because way more than Indians lost that land. I mean, every living thing on earth lost that land. And then Alaskan Indians are not Indians, they are Alaska natives. So it becomes hard. It becomes very hard to talk. So somebody said something about plundering, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but I have a saying, and it really matters to me. And it even matters to me about the orange one in Washington. I don't want him reelected. Look, let me be very clear. But I don't wish him ill will. I don't wish him to be exposed for anything horrible. I hope I'm wrong. I don't wish ill will. So I have a saying that I don't want anybody to fall. I really don't. So I hope that even the worst of us don't have to fall. That's a true hope of mine. So I also hope that anything I said didn't give you a feeling that I was trying to in some way tumble somebody else, because it's not in my nature, period. I already told you I'm speaking only for me. And Amber Alerts was the last thing that was said. Tom, have you thought what you're...
Yeah.
Okay, just keep that thought. Amber Alerts is the last thing that was said, and it's the last thing that I will address, and I will tell you thank you again for tolerating me. I think that's an interesting point. I really do. Why would there not be any notices of American Indian people if we know the numbers, which are way more than one a day, and if not 1,000 a day. And what about tribal children? And there's a couple of things going on there. One is that Indian people, this is another one of those convoluted things that happen. Indian people are supposed to report to their tribal police first if it happens. And so that means you've all watched Alaskan Highway Patrol, whatever it's called, and you watch the policeman drive 400 miles to go to hear one report. And then what you don't see is when the officer gets there, he goes, well, you really should have called your tribal police. And the same thing happens again. So, and it's the same whether it's in Oklahoma or anywhere. One of the pastors of the Dallas Indian United Methodist Church, he got reappointed Methodist. He got reappointed to, I can't think of it right now, but anyway, the Ponca Reservation in Oklahoma, even though there aren't any reservations in Oklahoma. And what's the name of it? I can't think. And his son got pulled out of the car and beat up at the gas station on the corner. And I said, Abe, did the police come? And he said, no, they're off. It's because the tribal police, and they really were. It was Friday, and they didn't work on the weekend because the Ponca tribe didn't have the budget. And that's, as we know, how it works. So, and they couldn't call the county police because, all heck would have broke loose. We know what the dangers of that are. And I think tribal children, I've heard explanations of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And I've seen it. I watched back in 1977 when I started teaching. I taught with a teacher who had adopted an Indian child. I didn't know anything about the Indian Child Welfare Act. She was a middle-aged lady, and she had not had any children, and she was single, and she had adopted a baby, and she was so happy, and the baby had been with her about 3 months. And the tribe came and got the baby and took it away. And that was that. And so I've seen both sides. And it's heart-wrenching. And I don't know how you explain that. So when we see the statistic that tribal children go missing more often, it's hard for me to wrap my head around what exactly do they mean. Do they mean they're not in Indian hands, or do they mean they're not here, or what does that mean? And heaven forbid that it would be a dual citizenship like Cherokee and Comanche. Oh my gosh, that would be a toughie right there.
That confusion aids those who are doing the.
It is absolutely a slit through which they can crawl. Yep. And so anyone, no matter whether it's tribal or not. So that's about it. You guys learned a lot, and I appreciate anyone who is interested in tribal, learning about tribal issues. Tom?
It's not right for me to bring up anything after he speaks, so I want to thank you for doing a great job here tonight. And they'll kick us out here at 10:30, but our formal meeting is over. Yeah.